guys, welcome back to Andy's Dinosaur Reviews, and we have some very interesting Pentaceratops figures to take a look at today. These were just random figures that started to show up a few months back on eBay and AliExpress. I actually had intentions of picking them up for quite some time, and then I just kind of continuously passed them over for other things, but I recently found them on AliExpress for actually like around $7 or $8, and that was with shipping, so I was like, well, I can't say no now, I mean, that's so cheap. So I went ahead, placed an order, and we now have them here. And at first glance, you might be looking at these guys and thinking, wow, those are blatant bootlegs of the Papo version, just kind of repositioned. However, I actually think they may not be. I think they're just kind of based on the Papo version, because I was just taking a look at the Papo version in comparison to these a moment ago to try to see if I could, pick out some very obvious similarities. And when you actually look at the two together, although they have very similar appearances, they actually look like they're just kind of based on that Papo Pentaceratops and not actually bootlegged from it. However, I could be wrong. You can be the judge of that, but I thought the figures definitely looked really interesting, and you can see there's two different paint variants of the figure. You have a brownish version as well as a greenish version, which is definitely nice to see two different versions of the figure. And I think overall, the paint applications, although not perfect, look, pretty decent for being kind of almost like those bootleggish type figures, which potentially they may be bootlegs, potentially they may not be, I'm not too sure. But again, they don't look terrible, I will say that. Not great, definitely not the quality of many different companies out there that we know and love, but they're also not the worst thing ever. They do actually have a brand name attached to them, and I don't know the company at all. You can see it's right there, and I've never heard of them, unless it was like maybe just a random figure that I've purchased before that was sold similar to these, where they're almost like unknown figures. So, we do have a brand name attached to them, but I'm thinking we're not going to find out much information about the company or anything that produces these. But again, pretty cool looking figures, so let's go ahead and jump straight to a closer look right now. So we will start with the brownish version here, and taking a look at the head sculpt, you can see that we have some pretty decent looking detail within the head sculpt of our Pentaceratops. Like the skin texture definitely looks pretty nice. It's not, as fine as I would probably like to see the scaling. The scaling actually looks really big and bulky, but it doesn't look bad. We have some nice skin wrinkles and stuff all the way running down through the throat. Some really nice detail there. The mouth is in an open position, similar again to the Papo Pentaceratops. Has that same similar look to it. And the mouth definitely seems to be sculpted quite nicely. You can see some pretty decent detail in there. The tongue and a really nice realistic tone of color used for the inside of the mouth. The beak is painted, but it's painted pretty sloppily actually. Like you can see the bottom is really sloppy, but it's been kind of given like a really nice dark wash, and that was the way that they painted it. And if it were a little more consistent as far as the placement goes, I think it would have looked pretty nice, but because it's a little sloppy, it doesn't look that great. You can see the nostrils as well as the horns back here as we start to lead back into the top of the head of our Pentaceratops. And the horns have been painted just like the beak, where it's just been kind of given like a really nice dark wash, like a really dark wash. And it does make the detail of the horns pop pretty nicely, so that is definitely a plus, and also looks pretty decent as far as like darkening the top of the head from like the eye socket area up, so that also looks pretty decent, and I definitely do like that area of the paintwork. The eyes have been painted with a very nice dark brown as well. I feel like maybe a lighter tone of color for the eyes could have looked a little better, but at the same time, that doesn't look bad either. It definitely looks decent, and you can see there is a nice gloss coat added to the eye for a little extra added bit of realism. As we lead up into the frill of our Pentaceratops, the spikes that run along the frill are very sloppily painted, and that's probably the worst area of this figure paint-wise that I can make out so far. But you can see that as far as the detailing in the frill goes, that as well looks quite nice. And we just have kind of like almost eyeballs that look here all over the frill as far as the design goes, so it's not anything overly flashy or, complicated. It's very kind of straight to the point and simplistic, but it looks okay. Definitely wouldn't have been my first choice, but at least they did give it, a little hint of flashiness up in the frills somewhere where you would probably like to see some flashiness. But this one being a brownish color, maybe the green one actually would have been more of a male. I feel like this one would have been more of a male. This one would be more of a female, so you could have gotten away with not adding in that little hint of flashiness, but it is what it is. It still looks okay. You can also see that they've dry brushed some of the detail out here on the frills so that there's some color variation. A few different shades of brown, lighter and darker shades are included up here. And you can also see the darker brown here kind of runs out and borders around the edge of the frill as well, leading back here into the eye area of our Pentaceratops. But again, the detailing looks decent. It's not great, but it's not bad. But you can see that again, the paintwork of the spikes that run around the frill are very sloppily done. And then as we move back into the body, you can definitely see some pretty nice looking structure to the dinosaur, kind of like a very, similar to the Papo version, kind of like a hump here on the back, and then a slight hump there showing off the hip bone area, as well as again some very large scale detail throughout, especially in the stomach. Lightens quite nicely, actually, a pretty smooth transition to an off-white here for the stomach region, and you can kind of see like some variations of brown creeping through the white area, which looks nice. And you can see also that the brown here out in the body does have some variation to it, like you can see a lighter shade here, a little bit of like an orangish darker shade here, and you can also see that those transition back and forth quite nicely, and there is some dry brushing included throughout to highlight some of the detail, although I'm not a huge fan of the dry brushing that they've applied here, which is kind of a black or a dark gray. It almost looks a little bit sloppy because of the dry brushing. But you can see some muscle definition as you move down the front leg. The foot sculpt looks okay. The nails are painted with a glossy black, but they are absolutely in no way, shape, or form painted nicely. Well, I mean, not too bad. These ones look okay. That one's missing quite a bit of paint, and that one's just kind of sloppy as well. But it's not the worst thing in the world. You can see some more skin folds and stuff down here in the lower part of the stomach. As you move back here, you can see some muscle definition in the thigh, as well as the calf moving down. You can see a little bit of a seam where the leg was connected, it looks like, but it's not too bad. You can also see the foot sculpt down here, again, has that glossy black nail paint. As we move back up here into the tail, you can continue to see some pretty nice looking detail throughout, as well as quite a bit of like creasing and stuff here as we lead out into the tail, and some variations of lighter and darker shades of brown. Like I kind of like how it just stripes down, like the orangish brown stripes down into like that kind of like a khaki type color. And the underside also sports some really nice like scale detail, like beautiful, very reptilian like scale detail here for the underside of the Pentaceratops. Definitely like that as well. When we come over here to the opposing side of the head, that looks pretty much just like the previous side did. There's no real big differences or anything paint-wise, but I do really quite like the paint application there of the head. But you can see lots and lots of wrinkling to the skin, almost looking like it has kind of like saggy skin and stuff throughout the face, leading down here into the neck region of our Pentaceratops. I think that looks really nice. The rear here of the frill also looks really cool, and you can see some really nice paintwork back here. Maybe not the best in the world, but I do like how the kind of brownish scales pop with a lighter coloration underneath. Definitely highlights the scales quite nicely. And you can see again, similar to the opposing side, we have some really nice muscle definition here to the front leg as well as the rear leg. You can see a little less of the stomach here because the legs are closer together. It almost appears as though the Pentaceratops is almost in sort of like a defensive position, like it's kind of trying to hold its ground against a predator. And you can see that again, the legs are really nicely defined as far as the muscle definition goes, especially if it's trying to stand its ground. It would be, tensing the muscles, and that's quite nicely shown in the sculpt. As you lead down into the feet, you can see on both the front and rear legs that we have again that glossy black nail paint. But overall, I think that it looks really nice as far as the detailing and paintwork goes for the majority of the figure. Just some areas look, a little iffy. Like this transition here from the off-white here up here isn't near as smooth as what we saw over here. Like, look at how super nice and smooth that is. But over here, that paintwork is definitely applied a little bit too thick, and the transition isn't quite as smooth or lifelike as it probably should be. And I will say the dry brushing looks a little nicer over here than it did on the opposing side, but I still feel like if they would have chosen a different color to apply that dry brushing, it might have looked a little bit better. You can see the skin kind of stretching here off of the tail as this leg is pulling forward, obscuring a little bit of the stomach detail right there, and then we lead out into the tail yet again. Pretty nice looking detail out there in that area. The greenish version is exactly the same figure sculpt-wise, so we don't really need to look at anything sculpt-wise on this one, just basically the differences, which would be the paint application. And primarily, you can see that it's painted very similarly to the brownish version, where we have kind of like a really dark wash applied to the beak and the horns to really highlight the detail. I think the wash that they used on this one might be even darker than the previous one. And similar to the brown one, we have a very nice dark coloration that overtakes the majority of the face. And that's one thing that is a little bit slightly different between this one and the brown version, is that there's more of the darker color, as this like ends up in the lower jaw. The brownish version cut off like right around here, and it was just kind of under the eye. This actually goes down for the majority of the face. We also have a slightly different shade of color for the inside of the mouth on this one. We have a purple as opposed to kind of like that pinkish tone that we had on the other one. Same style of paintwork up here on the frill though, where we have those kind of like spots almost looking like eyeballs, round circular eyeballs, but eyeballs nonetheless up here on the frill, but it doesn't look really any better or any worse than the previous one. Again, similar style of paintwork as well, where we have a darker coloration that kind of borders around the outer edges of the frill, and then lighter tones of color in the mid area of the frill. And we also have super sloppy paintwork throughout the spikes that run along the frill as well, just like we saw on the previous one. You can see that it transitions nicely to a lighter green as we get down here into the neck and throat region, and then we also have some variations of darker greens as we lead back here into the body. And similar to the brownish one, it looks as though we have that very dark dry brushing throughout as far as like a dark gray or a black, but it definitely looks nicer on this one as far as that dry brushing goes than it did on the previous one. And just like the other one, we have some light kind of creamy coloration here in the stomach region. Pretty smooth transition to that color, but not great. But I love the kind of lighter green that creeps through those white areas of the stomach, and that looks really quite nice and shows off the scale detail quite beautifully as well. Again, some darker shades of green used on the legs. Same paint for the nails, as we have a glossy black, it seems. No difference there. We can see some variations of the lighter and darker shades of green showing up in certain areas of like the stomach and the sides of the legs and everything. And you can also see that as we get to the tail here, we have a dark green striping that runs the course of the tail, which I really like that aspect, just adding a slight hint of flashiness to the figure. The underside has a really nice kind of a light brown coloration, and I think that shows off the detail here of the underside a bit nicer than the previous one did. It seems to have a little bit of a dark wash to it, but nothing that's, all that well done. Doesn't make the scale detail pop as nicely as it could, but it does still look pretty decent. And then of course we would have that same coloration and paintwork over here. It looks pretty consistent for the most part. There's like some random browns that are showing up here. Like I see it right here over the hip region. I also saw it right here. I don't know that paintwork is actually meant to be there, or if that was maybe just some of the paintwork of the brownish one that rubbed off on the greenish one here in transit because they were together in the packaging. I'm not entirely sure, but I figured it was worth mentioning. The rear of the frill, similar to the brownish one, has that light green kind of creeping through the darker green scales, where the brownish one had a light brown creeping through the darker brown of the scales, and I really like the way that they've painted that as well. Really nice dry brushing technique they used back there. And just like the brownish one, I think this side here of the creamy color is applied a little bit too thick, but it doesn't look bad either. Again, a little nicer than the brownish one, I will say that. So this one is probably actually my favorite, I would say. I think I like this one a little bit better than the brownish one, but it's really kind of hard to tell, as they are actually both quite appealing looking. And now to show you the differences between the Papo version, which is the suspected figure that may have been bootlegged from, and this version here. You can definitely see straight away that as far as the positioning goes, it's very different. Very, very different looking poses for the figures, but even just kind of looking at the way that the head sculpt is, you could see a very strong difference between the head sculpt of this version and the Papo version, like the shape of the head. The frill of the Papo version goes up a lot more, like straight up on the figure, as opposed to this one here in the background having a slight tilt to it. The horns definitely look very similar, but if we actually get close to them, you can see that although they are very similar, the detail is definitely a lot nicer and a lot more fine, I would say, on the Papo version compared to this one. And the horn, the nasal horn of this one is significantly larger than what we see on the Papo version. So there's that as well. And another area that's just a really little subtle area that I picked up on that's quite different between the two would be the distance between the beak to the nasal horn here. Like you can see it's a little longer on the Papo version and also shaped differently than what we see on this version here. So there's definitely some very strong differences. Even the spiker on the side of the face is shaped differently than the one that we see on the Papo version. It's actually a lot nicer here, as opposed to almost not even having anything other than just a spike sticking out of the cheek here. We have more structure to the face of this one. The beak is also shaped differently. There's a little bit more of a curve to the beak of the Papo version, whereas there's a lot less of a curve to this one. Now, a lot of this could just be due to the way that they maybe bootlegged it, or maybe it really is a different figure that's just based on the Papo version and given a different shape to the body. Again, you can see that the body has like that significant kind of a hump here, but it's a lot more elaborated on the Papo version than you see on this version. We also have ridges that run along the back on Papos. We don't have that here, and just generally the body and the detailing of the body looks very different on this one compared to the Papo version. Even the texturing to the skin is far different than what we see on the Papo version. So there truly is a lot of difference between the two, even though at first glance it really looks like a very obvious bootleg of the Papo version. I honestly have my suspicions that maybe it's not, and it was just kind of based on the Papo version, as it does share a lot of the similar attributes to the Papo version, with like the overall appearance and the style of the head sculpt and everything, but again, sporting a good bit of difference as well. As far as a size goes, since they're the same figure, we can go ahead and push that one out of the way. For a length, you are looking at about 7.5 inches or 19 centimeters. And then for a height, the highest point clearly would be the frill, about 5.25 inches or 13.5 centimeters. For a size comparison, there is Mr. Papo T-Rex, the Attack Pack Colovosaurus, and Robert Muldoon from the Mattel Jurassic World toy line in comparison to our Pentaceratops figures right here. And you can definitely see that they do sport a pretty good size. They are definitely not very small, but they're not super huge either. I would say pretty darn nice size overall for a Pentaceratops figure, almost in that perfect size range. But hopefully in comparison to these guys, you can definitely see that they do sport a pretty decent size overall. So these random AliExpress, eBay, potentially bootlegs, potentially not, Pentaceratops figures are actually quite nice, but they're not that great. You know, they do have that strong bootleg feel as far as like the appearance to the material, the sloppy look to the figures. Like they definitely are not only advertised like, but appear like they would be bootlegs, or at least they're produced by a company that doesn't seem to care too much about the appearance of their figures. And we can also see straight away from the tag that showed us the name of the company that produces them that they are no stranger to bootlegs, as that tag was completely covered in images of bootlegged figures. So that also raises suspicions as far as these figures go. But again, I'm still going to debate the fact that potentially they're not bootlegs and they're just kind of based on the Papo Pentaceratops, but they very easily could have just been altered and turned into what we see here. Again, I have no real proof or no idea for sure, but I will say that beside all of that, they do look pretty decent, you know, like the paintwork isn't terrible. It's, you know, a little ugly in certain areas, but kind of decent in other areas. It's definitely not the most appealing Pentaceratops figure that I've ever seen, and doesn't even compete with a majority of the more well-known companies out there like Collect A, Safari, Papo, all of that stuff. Like, these aren't near as nice as the type of figures that they would produce, especially when it comes to the paintwork. Like, the paintwork is just kind of overbearingly strong. Like on the greenish one in the face, you can see that that darker coloration doesn't really look very natural as far as the way it's applied, and is just really dark in the face, and it just doesn't look like body color. It looks more like paint on a figure, and they both have like a dry brushing over top of them, and it looks okay on the greenish one, but on the brownish one, I feel like it doesn't look that great and kind of takes away from the figure, makes it look a little bit sloppier than it already did as far as the paintwork goes. So the paintwork isn't the greatest, but it's also not the worst. I've seen far worse than this, so, you know, they get a pass as far as the paintwork goes as like an okay paint job, but definitely nothing to go crazy over. The sculpts as well are pretty decently done. They sport some pretty nice detail throughout, showing off some really nice skin wrinkling, some really nice scale detail, and just generally pulling off the movement in the sculpt quite nicely. Nothing crazy as far as the pose, just kind of like almost a defensive pose, making it look like the Pentaceratops is just kind of like staying steadfast in that spot, trying to defend its territory or just generally protect itself against whatever may be approaching. So I do like the pose, but it's nothing that's insanely, dramatic or anything like that. Just a pretty nice natural pose. It doesn't need to be anything crazy sometimes. It can look nice just with a nice natural looking pose, and that's kind of what we see here. I also will say that the appearance to the face kind of furthers the idea of maybe it defending itself, as it almost has slightly a look of fear on its face with the mouth open wide and the eyes kind of open wide. It almost looks like it is afraid, so that may be a little bit more evidence pointing to the it defending itself idea. But again, the figures are decent. I will say that. They're not that great. They're not that bad. When I ordered them, I did not expect greatness. I kind of expected them to show up and be just okay. But since they were, pretty fun looking figures that I didn't have in my collection, and it's another ceratopsian figure out there, especially Pentaceratops, as we don't have too many figures of Pentaceratops. So I was definitely intrigued enough to pick them up, and I'm actually quite happy with the purchase. So if you would like to pick these up for yourself, I will include a link in the description to where you can do that on AliExpress, where I purchased mine. So make sure you head to the link in the description, go buy these very interesting Pentaceratops figures, and make sure you like, comment, and subscribe before you do, and I will see you in the next review. Thanks for watching.